LBJ's presidency. Lyndon Johnson became president following JFK's assassination and served the remainder of his term. He pledged to continue Kennedy's policies when he became president in November of 1963. He rammed Kennedy's stalled civil rights and tax cut bills through Congress, using Kennedy's assassination to make those the goals of the martyred president. He began his war on poverty by pushing bills through Congress, costing billions of dollars. And in 1964, he announced a tax cut of about $10 billion, which resulted in an economic boom for the country. In the election of 1964, Johnson would have to get reelected on his own right. The Democrats nominated LBJ on the platform of the Great Society, which was a sweeping set of New Deal-type economic and welfare measures aimed to transform America. Public sentiment for that was roused by Michael Harrington's The Other America, a book published in 1962. In Harrington's The Other America, he showed that 20% of the U.S. population and over 40% of African Americans lived in poverty. The Great Society intended to fix that. Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona, who is often characterized as being the father of modern conservatism. Goldwater attacked the federal income tax, Social Security, the TVA, civil rights legislation, nuclear test ban treaty, and the Great Society itself. In the campaign, the Great Society offered economic reform. However, Goldwater was characterized as a warmonger who might start a nuclear war. Goldwater disenfranchised many of his fellow Republicans with his extremism, and as a result, Johnson wins in a landslide. He defeats Goldwater 486 to 52 in the Electoral College. The Democrats also swept both houses of Congress with lopsided majorities. A Democratic president and a Democratic Congress now had a mandate for an unprecedented passage of legislation in the next 4 years. The Great Society was essentially a war on poverty. The Office of Economic Opportunity and the Equal Opportunity Act created an appropriation that doubled to nearly $2 billion. The Appalachian Regional Development Act of 1966, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, Head Start, which prepared educationally disadvantaged children for elementary school. The Medicare Act was passed in 1965 for the elderly and supported by millions of Americans being pushed to poverty by skyrocketing medical costs. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, was created in 1966. It provided for 240,000 housing units and $2.9 billion in urban renewal. In 1966, Robert C. Weaver, the HUD secretary, became the first African American cabinet member in U.S. history. The Immigration Act of 1965 discontinued the national origin systems of the 1920s, or the Quota Acts as they were known. Immigration was now based on a first-come, first-served basis. Immigrants with families already residing in the U.S. had a precedence. Immigration on things such as skills and the need for a political asylum, artists, scientists, and political refugees were given preference. The act more than doubled the number of immigrants coming in each year, mostly from Asia and Latin America. Consumer protection laws were also passed for full disclosure of cost of credit when borrowing money and regulating the use of harmful chemicals in food. In culture, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities aimed to lift the level of U.S. culture, and PBS, or the Public Broadcasting System, was created. Also in 1965, the Water Quality Act was passed. The federal government could set clean water standards for states and forced industry to clean up the nation's lakes and rivers. And the space program continued, and ultimately the U.S. would win the space race. The Great Society also triumphed with civil rights. The 24th Amendment was ratified in January of 1964. It abolished the poll tax in federal elections, one of the tools used in southern states to keep African Americans from voting. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964, with Johnson's skill with Congress, allowed him to get Kennedy's bills passed. The provisions: it forbade segregation in hotels, motels, restaurants, lunch counters, theaters, sporting arenas, that did business in interstate commerce. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created to enforce the new law. Relieved individuals of their responsibility for bringing discrimination complaints to the courts themselves, the federal government now became responsible, with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission taking that role. It also eliminated remaining restrictions on black voting. Title VII said that discrimination based on race, religion, gender, and national origin was illegal. As a result, most businesses in the southern cities and larger towns desegregated immediately. Following the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Bill of 64 still didn't address the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. So there was a march held by Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC from Selma to Washington. Only 383 out of 15,000 African Americans were registered to vote in Selma, Alabama. After 2 months of beatings, arrests, and murder, civil rights leaders in Selma announced a climactic protest march from Selma to Montgomery. The first march, state troopers violently ended the march on a bridge outside of Selma. On March 9th, Martin Luther King Jr. led a second march. On March 15th, Johnson promised on TV to send a bill to Congress that would extend voting rights to African Americans in the Deep South. March 21st, the march proceeded peacefully from Selma to Montgomery with the protection of the federalized Alabama National Guard. The provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, literacy tests were deemed unlawful if less than 50% of all voting age citizens were registered. If so, African Americans could be enrolled whether or not they could read. If local registrars would not enroll African Americans, the president could send federal examiners who would. This gave teeth to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to the 15th Amendment, and as a result, 740,000 African Americans were registered to vote within 3 years. Affirmative action, which is also part of the Great Society. Johnson signed an executive order in 1965 requiring employers on federal contracts to take affirmative action to ensure underprivileged minorities and women were hired. President Nixon later furthered affirmative action. Countless American corporations that did business with the government, colleges and universities that received federal scholarship and research funding, became obligated to meet the guidelines of affirmative action. As a result, African American, Asian, and Hispanic enrollment in universities increased dramatically. The 1970s saw cries of reverse discrimination as the economy began to suffer and whites faced increased competition for jobs or were denied promotions and students were denied college admission as a result of affirmative action. In the Bakke case of 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that Alan Bakke, a white medical student, was unfairly turned down to medical school because of the admissions program that favored minorities. The court declared that preference in admissions could not be given to members of any group on basis of ethnic or racial identity alone, hence striking a blow to affirmative action. Jesse Jackson became a leading advocate in the 1970s and 80s for the continuing of affirmative action and for the furthering of civil rights. Affirmative action was weakened by the Supreme Court in the late 80s and 90s. In 1967, Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall as the first African American to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall had been the defense attorney arguing for Linda Brown in Brown versus the Board of Education. Forced busing. In 1968, the Supreme Court ordered an end to de facto segregation of the nation's schools. The court ordered school districts to bus children from all minority neighborhoods in the center cities to achieve integration of schools. In other words, students were forced to attend schools outside of their home district or closest school so that schools could be desegregated because society in and of itself had become segregated by custom, de facto. The issue became controversial with middle-class suburban whites in the early 70s up until the 1990s. The rise of black power and racial violence. Not all African Americans agreed with Martin Luther King's nonviolent methods. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 King's ideas seemed obsolete to many young African Americans. Many questioned whether it was a good idea for blacks to try and integrate with whites, and so the idea of black separatism emerged. It called for the separation of the races in America by returning to Africa or occupying an exclusive area of land in the U.S., which would be supplied by the federal government. It was the opposite of integration. It was inspired by the ideas of Marcus Garvey. The Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslim movement, was the most notable and well-organized institution of black separatism, and one of its most outspoken members was Malcolm X. He was the most vocal and brilliant orator of the Nation of Islam. He preached religious justification for black separatism and the furthering of African American rights through any means necessary. His views softened after his pilgrimage to Mecca. He left the Nation of Islam, but on February 21st, 1965, he was assassinated by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. He never supported King's nonviolent methods, and he questioned him publicly many times. However, had he not been assassinated following his pilgrimage, he may have been able to work more closely with Dr. King. The SNCC, or SNCC, and Stokely Carmichael also became more militaristic, or militant. They were influenced by Malcolm X. In 1966, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the SNCC called for civil rights movements to be staffed, controlled, and financed by blacks, thus rejecting interracial cooperation. They wanted to kick out the whites that had helped them. Black nationalism replaced integration as the goal. Black power, or an attempt to seize political power, was also a new idea which took hold amongst African American youth. Stokely Carmichael, one of the leaders of SNCC and later a member of the Black Panther Party based in Oakland, and founded by urban revolutionaries Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, promoted racial violence. Poverty, unemployment, and racial discrimination were common in major inner cities. A series of long, hot summers in 1965, 66, and 67, racial disorders hit. There were riots in Watts, Los Angeles, August 11th through the 16th, 1965. 34 people died. Over 1,000 were injured. 4,000 arrested. 1,000 buildings were destroyed. Property loss nearly cost $40 million. There were also major riots in Detroit in 1967. White businesses were targeted, but many black businesses inadvertently were burned to the ground as well. During the first 9 months of 1967, more than 150 cities reported incidents of racial disorder. In response, the Kerner Commission was appointed by LBJ to investigate the riots. The Kerner Commission's conclusion was that the frustrated hopes of African Americans had led them to violence. Approval and encouragement of violence by both white terrorists and by black protest groups also led to the violence, and that blacks had a sense of being powerless in a society dominated by whites. The recommendation of the Kerner Commission: the elimination of all racial barriers in jobs, education, and housing. Greater public response to problems of racial minorities, and increased communication across racial lines. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1968. The 39-year-old minister was shot while standing on a balcony with friends in Memphis, Tennessee. King was working to increase wages for Memphis trash collectors. King had lost many of his supporters when he began to oppose the war in Vietnam and speak out for poverty. Following his assassination, waves of violence broke out again. The rise of the New Left and the counterculture, the impact of the baby boom generation. In 1950, 1 million people went to college. In 1960, 4 million people went to college. The baby boomers were raised largely in economic security. 75% of college students came from families with income above the national average. Student protest movements were only a minority of the student population, maybe 10 to 15%. But the New Left that does form by the mid-1960s, the majority of Americans under age 30. universities became perceived as bureaucratic and indifferent to student needs. The Students for Democratic Society, or the SDS, which was headed by Tom Hayden, called for participatory democracy in universities. They led free speech movements on college campuses. Students at UC Berkeley started sit-ins in 1964 to protest prohibition of political canvassing on campus. They came to emphasize the criticism of the bureaucracy of American society. The SDS would become more militant during the Vietnam War. Many of America's youth became critical of U.S. policy and turned to alternative lifestyles. Music by musicians like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and the Beatles would come to influence American counterculture. Woodstock in 1969 came 3 days of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, with musicians like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin performing. The Warren Court. Chief Justice Earl Warren was appointed to the Supreme Court by Eisenhower in 1953. His court is considered one of the two creative periods in U.S. history for the Supreme Court. Warren's court stressed personal rights, especially First Amendment rights, placing them in a preferred constitutional position. In Brown versus the Board of Education, one of the most important decisions in 1954, they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. They also made reapportionment decisions, or one-person, one-vote decisions. As a result, the result has been an electoral reform, shifting power from rural districts to urban and suburban districts. It required states to redraw their voting districts for the U.S. Congress according to population, so that each district had roughly the same number of people. They also extended the rights of the accused. In Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963, it established that people accused of a crime have the right to a lawyer even if they can't afford one. In Escobedo versus Illinois in 1964, they ruled that one has the right to a lawyer from the time of arrest or when one becomes the subject of criminal investigation. In Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, where your Miranda rights come from, it required that the accused people be informed of their right to a lawyer and their right to not testify against themselves. In 1962, the Warren Court also banned school prayer and religious exercises in public schools. Women's rights. Eleanor Roosevelt's Commission on the Status of Women had highlighted inequalities that women faced, endorsed improvements in education, equal employment, child care, and government opportunities for women. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which is considered a classic of women's protest literature. She criticized the plight of women with domestic duties, or the cult of domesticity, who also had to work full-time employment at jobs that paid women less than men. With other feminists, she founded the National Organization for Women, or NOW, in 1966. NOW called for the equal employment opportunities and equal pay. They argued for changes in divorce laws to make settlements more fair to women. They sought the legalization of abortion, which was the most controversial of their issues. In 1967, they began advocating for an Equal Rights Amendment, or an ERA, to the Constitution, extending the same guarantees contained in the 14th Amendment for racial and religious minorities. Alice Paul had started this idea in 1923. It was passed by Congress in 1972, but failed by the early 1980s to get the required 38 states necessary for ratification. So it failed to pass as a movement limited to middle-class women, and pro-life groups argued against it. Changes in the law. In 1972, the federal government required colleges receiving federal funds to establish affirmative action programs for women and to ensure equal opportunity. In 1973, the court decision of Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. Several corporations were forced to provide back wages for female employees who had not received equal pay for equal work, and also had to establish hiring and promotion practices that no longer discriminated against women. Women experienced more inclusion in the military, and Title IX guaranteed equal access for girls to programs boys benefited from, for example, school sports. Other minorities also fought for their civil rights. Minority groups took the lead set by African American civil rights movement and began fighting for their rights. The Chicanos, or Mexican Americans, led by Cesar Chavez, and the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or the UFWOC, had succeeded in gaining improved work conditions for mostly Chicano agricultural workers. La Raza Unida, which was were locally based political parties that sought to increase the Mexican American vote in urban areas. Since the 1970s, a number of Mexican Americans have been elected to prominent political positions, and today the Mexican Americans and Latin Americans in general are one of the strongest voting blocs in the country. Native Americans also sought equality. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded in 1968. AIM took a more violent approach. They had seized the Indian Bureau in Washington, D.C. in 1972. They protested desperate conditions and reservations, unemployment, and illiteracy. In 1973, militant Native Americans, led by leaders of AIM and a branch of the Sioux, occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota. They held Wounded Knee for 2 months and gained national publicity. It eventually led to the Indians to gain back lost fishing rights and to receive millions of dollars in payments for lands taken earlier in U.S. history.